visualization capacity. We're honored to have you back today, and we are here to learn as much as you can teach us. So please take over the mic from now on.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank all of you. For those of you who were joined us yesterday, thank you for returning today. And for those of you who are just joining us today, welcome. So what I want to do is to take a few minutes to do some administrative things. I have uploaded or updated the web page. And if you were on the call in the session yesterday, if you could take a few minutes now, because what I'm going to do is just kind of give a recap. So what I'm going to cover in the first few minutes will be a review for you guys. So if you were on the session yesterday, if you could take a few minutes to complete the feedback survey, that would be wonderful. And there will be another feedback survey at the end of this session as well. So just want to give you some time to do that. For, like I said, those of you who are joining us today, just a little bit about myself. I am Dr. Vitria Bird. I am an assistant professor at Purdue University. I'm also the director of the Bird Data Visualization Lab. And I have several research interests that are around or centered around data visualization, either the pedagogy of data visualization or some other areas in terms of visualizing heterogeneous data and complex data in several different environments, as well as health-related data related to lupus, the symptom cluster management for healthcare in relation to lupus. I am also the founder and organizer of BPViz, Broadening Participation and Visualization, for which this series is a part of. So I am delighted to be able to broaden the scope of BPViz to include this workshop because it helps me to figure out what's needed, what's wanted, and to be able to present this content to you in a manner that is helpful to you in your research and what you plan to do going forward. Our organizers are myself and Richie Aurora and Brent League. The three of us have worked very hard to put this together for you, and so I do hope that you will find it to be very helpful for you going forward. Our goals, again, are to introduce participants to data visualization. And as I mentioned yesterday, we are just scratching the surface of what could be covered in data visualization. So I'm essentially compressing 16 weeks into 4 days. So just keep in mind that the information that I'm sharing with you today is meant to motivate you to think about your data in a different way, but also to motivate you to want to learn more about any of the topics or the things that I present here today. The objectives are to examine what data looks like and define data visualization, which is what we did yesterday, to illustrate how data visualization can improve the understanding of the story within the data. Today, we're going to take an even deeper look into information visualization using the data set that we started out with on yesterday. We are also going to introduce what I introduced yesterday, the data visualization process. So we will revisit that shortly and briefly, just to get you everyone on the same page and moving forward, so we can know what our next steps are, and then exploring different data visualization paths. So these are the objectives that I hope to reach and to work towards over the course of this week-long data visualization webinar. So hopefully you've had time, for those of you who were on the call in the session yesterday, you've had time to complete the brief survey feedback. And so now I will give a brief recap of yesterday to get everyone started on the same page. Yesterday, we discussed introduction to data visualization. We talked about building data visualization capacity and what that is. And so I took some time to explain what I consider to be a progressive learning path for building your own data visualization capacity. We talked about, the different stages or different levels, starting out with understanding data. Once you have an understanding of data, understanding the different types of applications that can be used, and also recall that the data dictates the type of tool that you will use in your analysis. Which brings us to the third layer, which is analysis, or you might consider yourself an analyst at this point. Also keep in mind that as you move up in these stages, the expectation is that you have competency and proficiency in each of the layers of the stages below. So you can literally work through these stages to reach the top of this pyramid as shown here to be at the development stage. I realize not everyone wants to be a developer, but what I hope is that you have at least a general understanding of what it takes to be at each one of these levels. And who knows, maybe in the future you may decide that you want to do some development, and hopefully this webinar series will give you a starting point for that. The next thing that we talked about was the data visualization process. The format or template that I have been using, have chose to use, are the 7 stages of visualizing data described in the book that's cited here. And I do encourage anyone who's interested in learning more about programming for data visualization to take a look at this book, because it gives you a nice introduction to programming. And so we looked at the 7 stages. We walked through each of those stages. And as you could see, there are 7 stages, and each stage impacts the other stages into this process. So data visualization is an iterative process, although presented yesterday and in this slide in a linear fashion. What I hope that you will remember is that it is nonlinear, and you can be in any of these stages at any given time. So for the purpose of introducing the process, I like this particular layout because it is simple, it's easy to interpret. You can see that the represent stage, which is further down into the process, according to this framework that's shown here, but it impacts a lot of the other stages in this process. And so you want to be very careful, very cognizant of what you're doing, what questions you're trying to answer, and also, what outcomes you're expecting, because all of these things will impact and influence the outcomes that you get and the data visualizations that you work on. The next thing that we looked at yesterday was the purpose of visualization. In a word, insight. So the purpose of visualization is not pictures. The pictures are the icing on the cake. It is insight that you're trying to gain, or insight that you're trying to share with your viewers. And so you want to be always thinking about the questions that you are trying to answer. Who is your audience? Because believe it or not, your audience also impacts the type of visualizations that you will create. For example, if your audience was elementary school kids, you would not create a very complex data visualization for that population. However, if you're working on your research and you're presenting a paper, then the expectation is that you would have a far more complicated visualization for your audience. So be thinking about too, as you are creating your visualizations, who your audience is, what you want them to be able to understand, and what you want to convey, because all of these things actually impacts your outcome. So remember, the purpose of visualization is insight. Pictures are just the icing on the cake. The next step in visualizing data is in storytelling. So I hope that you have located the slides that have been uploaded to the course, the webinar webpage. I'm going to try to click on this. I'm not sure what's going to happen. I may have to stop sharing for a moment to take a look at this, but I'm hoping that you were able to actually go and take a look at this website. If you can hold on, patient with me for one moment, I'm going to see if I can stop sharing that so that I could share this web link. Okay, hopefully you can see that this page talks about Napoleon's march to Moscow. And so the reason why I included this, because I really feel like no visualization workshop or webinar is complete without talking about some of the seminal works and some of the seminal people in data visualization. So Edward Tufte, if you have not heard of him, he is one of the seminal people that have done a lot of work that is basically kind of brought forth the resurgence of data visualization. So visualization, data visualization has been around a long time, although it may not have been presented in such a way, or we may not have talked about it in a way that we have been doing as of late. But if you think about it, people use visualizations to communicate for years. And so what he has done, Edward Tufte, the work that he has done, he has a 4-volume set, probably even more books now. But if you ever get the opportunity to see him in person, some of his lectures, I do encourage you to do so, and to get the 4-volume set of books that he has written. So the reason why I'm showing this is because this particular visualization shows a lot of information in just in one visualization itself. And so I'm hoping that you can see it, and that maybe you can zoom in. I'm going to try to zoom in here so that you can see a little bit more of this visualization. And so why is this so important? Because if you look at it, there's a lot of information that's captured, and how are they capturing this information? So on yesterday, someone asked about if there were design principles that we could use or to discuss, to consider when creating visualizations. This is a nice example showing some of those principles. So if you look at the thickness of the lines, we have on my screen, it looks tannish colored, brownish colored. That's showing you that there were 10,000 people, men in this army that was marching towards Moscow. And the thickness of the line indicates the size of the troops, how many there are. And as you move from the left side of the screen to the right side, hopefully you can notice that the thickness gets smaller and smaller as they approach their destination. So a lot of things were going on at that time, but this was a nice way that this information was captured. You can also see that there were some paths that deviated or went outside of, or in addition to parallel, but not with the main line. And so that indicates that perhaps some of the troops went in a different path, and then eventually almost caught up with the rest of the troops here. And so as the line makes its way over to Moscow, you will see that there's a second line, which is in black. And so that line is the line of retreat, or the line when they are traversing their path, trying to make their way back to where they started. And again, the thickness of the line indicates the size of the army. As it moves from right back to left, it gets thinner and thinner. And so again, that indicates the size, that there has been tremendous loss in the size of the troops. And so once they return back to where they started from, you can see a significant difference in the size of the army from when they started from when they returned. And so another thing that's also shown in this particular visualization is temperature. So again, you think about what are the different variables that you're dealing with the data sets that you're working with, and how might those variables impact the data and the story that you're trying to tell. And so in this case, temperature had a significant impact on the size of the army. They were not prepared for maybe the conditions that they encountered. And so if you think about a long time ago, in order to have this type of visualization in one graphic or in one type of presentation, you would have to have what are called like overlays, where you would have one variable on one sheet of paper and another variable represented on a second transparent sheet of paper, where you could actually, once you laid them on top of each other, you can see how they were related. But in this case, all of that information is contained in one visualization. And so for that reason, it is considered to be one of the best statistical visualizations ever. And I would anticipate any other visualization workshop that you go to from here on out, you will probably see some reference to this visualization as well. So I wanted to take a moment to share that with you. I am going to now attempt to stop sharing that and go back to the presentation.
I'll take this moment to mute all, and then I'll request Vitria to unmute herself in a bit because there's some echo. So that's why
Okay.
I mute all for a bit.
Okay. Is it okay to unmute, Ritu?
Yes, thank you, Vitria. It's slightly better than previously.
Okay.
There's still some, but it's better now.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, it's perfect now.
Oh, okay. Okay. So the other thing that we talked about on yesterday was advancing beyond data to look at insight. And so how do we go from acquiring the data to building those relationships to looking at the relevance of the information in the data that we have? And so this graphics that's shown on the slide here, we talked about going from building those relationships to identifying patterns in the data, trying to find some causality in the data, going from answering those questions of the who, what, where, and when, to looking at how. How is that data related? How is that knowledge and information? What does it suggest in terms of meaning and purpose? From there, we looked at moving on to the next level, which is understanding, trying to make some sense of all of this data that you have. You're looking at synthesizing that information to build on what you already know. And then lastly, the whole purpose and the goal of this is to tell a story, but also to make some predictions, to use this information to help you in making decisions or in making discoveries or showing your presentations in such a way that, again, it all gets back to having that understanding and that insight as to what you're trying to present. And lastly, what we did on yesterday was to have a hands-on exercise. So we shared, or I made available, a small data set, which was small enough so that you could manually take a look at it and explore it. And so at this time, I'd like to see if anyone is courageous enough to share with us any insights that you were able to uncover with that small data set, if anyone continued to work with it. So I cannot see the chat if anyone is typing anything.
So Priyanka says that they did.
Okay, excellent. They did continue to work with the data set, or did they find any insights?
Not sure. Okay. Insights. If we can also extract cold and hot count for every manufacturer. Oh, hang on a second. I'm sorry, I just typed a bunch of stuff here.
Okay.
Yeah, if we can also extract cold and hot count from every manufacturer, I tried to do so with the COUNTIFs function. It worked. Okay. And then 2, if we can get serial information corresponding to maximum and minimum values, tried with index, mix, match functions, getting errors. Are the negative values in some cells will fall in different dimension during data visualization in Tableau. I'm also not sure if we can visualize data in multiple dimensions in Tableau.
Okay, excellent. So you touched on one of the things that I was hoping that you would be able to to see in that data set. So I'm going to once again stop sharing so that I can show you the data set, the file itself, and just some of the things that I was able to do as well. So I'm working through this as well to see if we come across the same things. Let's see here. Okay, there we are. So hopefully you guys can see the spreadsheet. So this looks slightly different from what you have because I've been working with it, and I've added a couple of, as you could probably see at the bottom here, a couple of additional sheets. And so what you have, what you're looking at now is the original data set. And so I want to take a moment to just kind of walk through this and kind of talk through it so you can see some of the things that I was able to take a look at. Granted, I knew some of the things I was looking for. And so for you to mention, Priyanka, that this minus sign, what does that mean? So one of the things that you want to be aware of as you are doing data visualization, whether it's with your own data, and especially if you're working with data that you're getting from somewhere else that you did not create. And so if it's data that you created, then that would be considered primary data. If you are working with secondary data sources, which most of us do work with secondary data, the first thing that you should not do is assume that everything in the data set is correct because this -1 could mean almost anything. And so what you want to do is you want to be able to analyze this, take a thoughtful look at it and see if it makes sense. Does a negative number make sense being in this column called cups? To me, it does not. There are also some negative numbers in some of the other columns as well. If you look at potassium, so any of these values here, they should not be negative. And so that should be, at first glance, without doing anything, just taking a cursory look at the data, that should be like a red flag or something that you should take note of. And you should do this with any type of data that you have. So up until now, we've been, all day yesterday and today, we're looking at what I'm considering to be information visualization type data. Tomorrow, we will start looking at scientific visualization data. Same thing, you need to take a close look at the data. Does it make sense to have negative values where you see negative values? And if you see something that sparks an interest or, it's a red flag, document that, because at some point in this process, you will have to figure out what it means and or how you are going to deal with it. So documentation is very important. Although you're creating visualizations, it's also important for you to document because you want others to be able to understand what you're doing and also your thought process for why you made some decisions that you will make as you go through this data visualization process. So what I did was I took this data and I copied it to a different sheet. So very good practice, always, always, always. I can't stress this enough. Create a backup of your work before you start working on it because, things happen and you want to be able to return to its original state if you need to. And so what I did was I'm keeping the original data and then I copied it to a different sheet here. And so you'll see a lot of different things that I've done here just to kind of go through. I've added some color with things because I wanted to know where are those -1 values. So when I looked at it originally and I thought, oh, this looks good. It looks like it's ready to go. I'm being a student, one of my students, they would say, oh, since Dr. Bird gave it to me, it must be perfect. On the contrary, if I gave it to you, there's probably something in there that you want to make sure that you take a look at. And so in this case, what I did, for those of you who are familiar with Excel, you can do highlight these, you set conditions. And so to show you how I did that, if you're interested in doing that and learning how, you can just highlight the columns that you want to provide some type of condition to, and then you go to conditional formatting. And in this case, we could say, I want to know which ones are hot and which ones are cold. And so I will say highlight cells and rules equal to, and in this case, I'm going to say if it's hot, so I'm going to say H, that's what I'm looking for. Then you set the color coding that you want it to be. If I wanted it to be cold. So we'll just say blue if I wanted to change it, although blue isn't set here as a default, but you could set it to whatever color you want it to here. So I'm going to go with yellow if it's blue. And you have to set them each one separately or individually. So I would go back and say equal to, and if I wanted it to be hot, I'll leave it as H. So that's how I color coded this table for those cells that are color coded. Because one of the things that you can do in terms of figuring out, getting a little bit more insight with this data is to see what's the maximum and the minimum values. And so that was one of the things that we started to do yesterday. I'm just going to scroll over here. And so I went through and I calculated, what's the maximum and minimum values in the fat column and what's the maximum sodium in men, those types of things. I also took a look at, and this was where I first began to see, well, actually up here where I looked at, I put all the maximum and minimums together. This is where that -1 came in. And like I said, that was a red flag for me. So I thought, what are we going to do with that? So I just kind of made a note of it. I don't know if you guys noticed with that data set, the manufacturers, there's a coding for them, and each one has a letter that's associated with it. In the data set, there's an A, but in the description, there is no A. So that's one of the things. Again, these are little subtle things, and this is not a data set that you're going to do anything with it beyond today. But I added these things in here to say that paying attention to detail is very important, because what you put into the data or what remains in the data will impact the outcome that you will have. And so in this case, if you take a look at the description, you will see that there are 2 manufacturers that share the same letter, the letter P. P as in poly. So there's a P for post and a P for Purina. So I think there's probably a typo in the description. One moment. And so that would be one of the things that we would need to correct as we go forward. So I just highlighted that to point out that in the description itself, if you look at the very last paragraph where it talks about the manufacturers and how they're coded, we do not see the letter A there. Again, you want to put in, several what I call sanity checks, just to make sure that the numbers are aligning up, to see if in fact you are getting the numbers that you think that you're getting, or that you should get. So there's a whole series of steps that we could do, that we could walk through this process of visualizing this data. Did anyone actually go through and create any visualizations in Excel? We're going to load this file into Tableau later into the presentation here when we get to the hands-on part. So I'm just curious if anyone had gone as far as to load this data set into Tableau.
So Vitria, this is Brent. There are a couple of other questions.
Okay.
Or comments based on your previous question.
Okay.
So the next one comes from Jaime. Jaime is asking, what about the units? For instance, are the weights in grams or ounces that would have a serious implication in the resulting story?
Yes, thank you so much for mentioning that. So yes, so that's what I didn't give you enough information for this assignment. And so one of the things that you have to do, what I encourage students to do, is to write down what are your assumptions, because your assumptions will help you to kind of figure out, okay, what units should we be looking at? No units were given. So yes, you were absolutely right. You have to make some assumptions, or you have to say, okay, I'm assuming that this is in grams. In terms of cups, I will assume. So what I will do, so I have a series of, and I was debating whether or not, I wasn't sure if you guys would want to see this or not, but since the question was asked, I will share it. Give me one moment to share this as well. So when we walked through that process yesterday, which was the data visualization process, And because we were looking at that, I have a series of worksheets that we do in class. And so the first step is the acquire stage. You don't necessarily, because someone did ask yesterday, do we have to do all of these steps? You don't necessarily have to do it, but I think this is a good example to show you just the process. So in this case, you would identify your data sources. And in this case, the data source with the data file was provided to you. What format is that data in? And so the data was provided in CSV and in an Excel file format as well. The worksheet asks what data types are there. And so this is where we really take a close look at the data, kind of making sure that we understand every element of that data. So the data types include, there are strings, there are integers, there are characters, there are floating point numbers. And again, the file was provided either as a text file or as an Excel spreadsheet file. So there were two formats that the data was in. We then go on to evaluate those variables. And so I made a list of all of the variables and the parameters to indicate, if they are integers, if they're numbers, what exactly would I be expecting in this particular case. Now, if you ever get a data set that someone has taken the time to give you a summary of every data point in that data set, you should thank them because that really helps you to save a lot of time. And so this is basically what I've done here is I've gone through for this page to look at every variable that's in there. And so at the bottom here, who is your audience? What assumptions are you making? Are there any inconsistencies? And so this question that's at the bottom of this page is actually answered at every stage going forward, because you do make assumptions and you do hopefully will notice some inconsistencies. And so in here, I said the class could be the audience could be either the class that you're in or for which the assignment was for, or it could be consumers, or it could be manufacturers. But thinking about the content of the data, I would say it could be either one of those. And at this point, I don't rightly know if this was an assignment that was given to me. So what I want to do is, so after I've acquired the data, if I go to the next step, which would be parsing the data, and I'm hoping, can you guys see this next document that says parse?
No, we're still on the acquire.
Still on the acquire. Okay. Let me see if I can. Stop it. Okay, so this is the parse document here. And what you'll see is I'm just moving through those stages that I mentioned yesterday. So I have all of the variables listed here. I'm telling it it's a string, the serial is a string, alphanumeric variables, which means that it could be numbers and letters as well. I'm also indicating, what those responses might look like. And as I mentioned, we have two variables or two manufacturers that are mapped to the letter P. And so I've highlighted this here to make a mental note for myself that as I go forward, I think one of those should be an A or something else other than that, because it will get confusing when you start to create visualizations for the data. The type is of character 1. And so here, this is, again, this is the parsing stage, very tedious, but I guarantee you, once you do this and you work through these stages, when you start putting this data into your visualization tool, whether that's Tableau or any other tool, you will have a clear understanding and intimate knowledge of what that data is. And so in particular here, where I have carbohydrates, I started to put in the value -1 does not make sense. So these are just notes to myself. No one will see them. The only reason you're seeing them now is because I'm sharing this with you. But as I'm going through and working through this process, and as you're doing the same, make notes to yourself. If it doesn't make sense, jot it down so you can come back and you can take a look at it. And so for each one of those fields where I color coded and I saw that there's a negative value, as I'm working through this worksheet, I'm making note of that because I will have to come back at some point and address that. Below that, any assumptions. And so here is where I'm actually addressing it. A value of -1 for these variables does not make sense at all. How do we treat the -1 values? So one thing that you'll have to do, -1 is what is in this data set, but that does not necessarily mean -1 will be in the data sets that you will work with. So what you need to do is to have a clear understanding of what the range of values should be. Sometimes -1 might mean an obsolete value, or it could be that the data wasn't entered there, and so some spreadsheets you can't have empty values. And so you need to be clear, this is no universal rule here, but usually if there's a number that's outside of the range of values that is expected, then that tells you that something is going on for that particular entry. And so you'll need to come up with some type of rubric or guidelines for how you will handle that, and also document it so that when you create your visualizations, if the question comes up, how did you deal with missing values? So that's usually the question that you'll get, or how did you deal with incorrect values? And so in this case, I'm treating this -1 because it seems, like I said, it doesn't make sense to be in the columns that they're in. I am going to treat that as incorrect data, or maybe missing data for the data set. Again, I'm noting there are two cereals that have the same manufacturer's code, and as I listed before, there's one cereal, Mapo, is on the list, but the manufacturer's code is unknown. So again, A comes into play here. And I'm not clear on the column that says shelf, what that represents. It could be shelf life, or it could be the number of boxes that are currently on the shelf. And so again, depending on who your audience is, what you're trying to convey, you'll need to decide which one of those it might be. If it's shelf life, then is the number in days? Is it in weeks? Is it in months? Is it in years? So think about diving deeper into that data set, looking at every single variable and making sure that you understand what those variables represent. And so again, remember I said, as you move along in the data visualization process, take notes of your assumption. What assumptions are you making? So now one thing that students like to say, I'm not making any assumptions. I would beg to differ. I think we all make assumptions. You may not write them down, but you do make assumptions whether you are aware of them or not. And so in this case, as you're dealing with data, you want to make sure that you are making note of the assumptions that you're making, because again, it does impact the outcomes of your data. So my assumptions were, at this point, the cups column is representing serving size, and as the question that led to this long explanation pointed to, is that I am assuming that the measurements are in grams. So as we look at some of the other variables, some of them may be in milligrams, but at this point in the process, this is what the assumptions that I'm making is this. So this is the parse worksheet. I am going to stop sharing it. So I didn't do all 7 stages, but I will share with you the ones that I have done. So the next one, that was parse. We will take a look at, it should be the mine, but I don't see it. Give me one moment to open that up as well. Okay, and I will share it. So remember, in the mining stage, this is where statistics come in. And I believe one of the questions yesterday was, what is the difference between data visualization and statistics? So statistics allows us to identify those patterns, or the things that there seemed to be some similarity or no similarity at all. So statistics gives us that opportunity to look at those patterns, to see what things are similar, what things are different. And so in this mining stage, again, we are getting very clear on what this data set looks like. In the first part of this, the analysis part, we're looking at the basic descriptors for each of those fields. And so as you could see, with each worksheet, I'm going deeper and deeper, finding more and more information about what I could possibly do with those variables. And so I've added an additional column for the different types of functions that could be used. Now, the functions that I'm referring to are in Excel. Some of you may use R or RStudio or some other package where you may have some different functions that you might use. And again, this is a simple data set, but I would imagine the data that you're going to be working with is going to be far more complex, and you will be using more complex functions. But this is a way to kind of think about what are the things that I want to be able to know about this data set, or what can this data tell me right now? And so what I've done, if I was to give this to a student right now, this would give them a starting point to say, this is where I want you to start looking. These are the different types of functions, the different types of things that you can do to look at these different variables as a starting point. The expectation is that they would go further than that. And so again, I've added in, these are the actual calculations. I didn't do average, but I threw that in there because, you know, those are the types of things you can do. But in my Excel spreadsheet, I did calculate the max and min for all of these. And then I started to see, can I categorize these things? You know, are there different categories that exist naturally in the data? One thing that data visualization allows you to do, this process, is for you to create your own categories. So it's always nice to see if there are any natural categories or groupings that occur. And in this case, you can see that the first three columns of this table in the second group are characters or strings. So that could be a category. The other remaining categories or clusters could be, or groupings could be, that the rest of them are integers in some form or fashion. And then I go on to say, you know, this one is a floating point number, because if you look at the number, the values that are in that column, then that tells you it's a floating point. And so it could be and should be treated a little differently. Again, I made myself another note, not sure if the shelf life is a number of boxes on the shelf. See my notes below here. In this part of the worksheet, you may or may not have data or information that is temporal. And so that means if it's time related. If you don't have that, you don't have to complete that. But I like to include this because sometimes you do have data that does have a time component. So one value could be considered in terms of time would be the shelf column. And again, I noted that, not sure if it's the shelf life or, you know, the number of boxes on the shelf. I then went on, again, these are notes that I'm making to myself. If it's considered to be shelf life, then maybe it's for a customer. That's who my audience is. If it is for the store owner, then it could be, or the place where it's selling the cereal, it could be the number of boxes currently on the shelf. So this, in this case, is a work in progress, which means, as I mentioned before, your first visualization won't be your last. Your first assumptions won't be your last at all. And it's okay to continue to update this as you go forward. In fact, you should update it as you go forward. And so again, there's range and distribution. This is where, again, I've kind of copied in that same information that I had put in before. I was going through and revising this. And so what you can see, hopefully, instead of just saying that all values, that the -1, I specifically said this value should be 0 or higher. So this tells me if I see anything else that is less than 0, then something is going on, or that data needs to be addressed, or a closer look at it. So as we move forward into the stages of using these worksheets, I am getting more and more specific about the data that exists. And so as you're working through the worksheets, don't feel like you have to go back and so I have to correct this or correct that. You leave those previous worksheets as your documentation because you want to see the whole process, because you learn from every step and every stage that you work through. Now, you may have to go back through it once you get to a stage that in the process that requires, remember, an iterative process. So just keep in mind as you're working through looking at your data. And again, this is a simplified data set, but I'm hoping that the concepts that we're talking about, the process is that you are looking at, that you can think about this as you're looking at your own data, which will be far more complicated than this. So I went through and I started to answer some questions, and these are just questions that I came up with as I was looking at the data. You know, how many different types of cereals are there? We concluded yesterday that there were 77. How many different manufacturers are there? 7. And then I started to kind of pull out some information. You know, how many cereals does each manufacturer in the data set have, and who has the most? And so these are some things, or some questions that can be answered in here where I'm answering them, but they could also be a starting point for creating visualizations as once you pull this data set into Tableau or any other data set visualization tool that you might have. And so again, I'm keeping the color coding because I don't want to forget that there is a special rule here or something that needs to be done, because you don't know how that's going to be represented in that data set once you start to visualize. And so you want to be able to think about, what will I do? What will I do with these numbers? So again, I'm just going to scroll down. Now this part was really interesting because if you wanted to answer the question, which cereal has the highest calories, proteins, and all of that, I created this table, and it allows me to see which one of these, are, how many of them are there, first of all. It has the lowest fat content, by which manufacturer. And so this is a table. You may recall, and you can see where I stopped here. You may recall I stated yesterday, if you have data and it makes more sense to create a table, and that's you can gain the insight that you're looking for with the table, go with the table. Don't just create a visualization for the sake of creating the visualization, especially if that visualization complicates things. Remember, the purpose of visualization is insight. And so you don't want to complicate it if you don't have to. So this is, again, like I said, I'm working through these worksheets that I have. I'm actually going to give this assignment to my class in the fall. So it is helpful for me to have worked through the process as well. And so one of the things that I thought would be nice to see once I complete the table up here would be, how many cold and hot cereals are there? And so for the class, the assignment that I'll give, I won't complete the table. I'll have them to complete it themselves, but calculate the percentages. Why might we want to know percentages? We might want to create a pie chart. And so we'll talk a little bit about pie charts versus different types of charts. And so there is this consensus to never use a pie chart. And I understand why, and I agree with that to a certain extent. I will say, don't use a pie chart if you have more than 2 or 3 variables that you want to display, because once you get beyond that, it really becomes difficult. And I will say, don't do a 3D anything, because it obscures the view and it makes it hard to actually see the raw numbers of the data that's there. So if you have a choice, if you are just so compelled to use a pie chart, make sure that you limit the number of variables that you are visualizing in that pie chart so that each value and variable can be easily seen. So again, now I am revisiting, these assumptions. How many entries in the data sets have a value of -1? And so in this case, using that color coding, showing the highlights that I demonstrated earlier, this helps me to identify where those -1s are. You can also use the count function, highlight all of the data, and then use a function that says equals count if the value is -1. It will tell you how many -1 values that you have there. Again, what does the value of -1 mean? These are questions that I'm asking of myself. How will you deal with that value? Does it make sense? So again, my assumptions at this point, so now we are in the mind stage. So remember, I've had assumptions from the acquire stage up to now. Who is my audience? At this point, I am making a definitive decision to say my audience will be the consumer. And that's going to help to shape the type of things that I'm looking for or how I present the data going forward. I'm assuming that the shelf column represents shelf life in months. Remember, I said it could mean a couple of things. I wasn't quite sure going forward. But like I said, right now, because the next stage after this, after the mind stage, is to filter and represent. And so in order to represent something, you need to know specifically how it is represented in the data. And so these are assumptions that I'm making. Someone else could have made totally different assumptions, and that is okay as long as you document it. And when you present your visualizations of the data, you make those assumptions known so that the person who is looking at your data or your visualizations will know your thought processes and how you came to make the decisions that you made, which of course impacts the outcomes. The value of -1, for me, in this case, I'm saying that it indicates invalid data was entered. And I also make a note to say I will document the entry. Even though I'm saying it indicates invalid data, I still need to know or to indicate what am I going to do with it. I have how am I going to treat it? There are a couple of ways to deal with it. Now, these are a couple of ways that I identified. Some of you may identify some other ways to do it as well, but just kind of get you to thinking about, again, everything that I'm presenting here with this simple data set. I hope that you are thinking about your own data as you're looking at your own data. What assumptions are you making? For those assumptions, are you documenting it? If you are graduate students, I'm hopeful that you have a research notebook that you write everything down, or you have some type of digital form of documentation where you are documenting what you're doing, because if you ever need to come back to that data, it will be helpful to have the documentation to refer to. And it will save you a lot of time from having to redo things. So I noted that there are a couple of ways of dealing with this. I could remove the entire record where there is a value in any field associated with the records that have the value of -1. In doing that, that's going to decrease my sample size. So hopefully you can see the impact that things have when you make these decisions. Or I could exclude only the columns of the data that have the value of -1 in its calculation. So the records, let's say if there is a serial that has a -1 in one of those values, let's say for potassium, but the rest of the values are all positive and they appear to be valid. Do I want to exclude the whole record, or do I just don't want to include, whenever I'm calculating something for potassium, don't include that? For my own sanity, I would probably just remove the entire record, because to keep it in there in this fashion means more record keeping. And again, this is a simple data set. Imagine if you had the type of data that you will be working with and having to keep track of all of that. Unless, of course, there's a specific reason why you need to, or you feel like you have to keep the remaining data in there, then I just would advise you to make sure that you are meticulous in your documentation so that you can go back, should you need to refer back to what you did. And the rest of this is basically, I went through and again added in the measurements. What measures am I using? And as I mentioned before, some of them are in grams, some are in milligrams. And so this is where I'm trying to document this entire process in the event that I give this to someone. So 9 times out of 10, when you get data from people, it won't be this level of detail already provided for you, but it will be helpful, especially if it's a data set that you did not create yourself, and it's one that maybe you're collaborating with someone and they provided the data for you. Ask these questions, and sometimes the answers will be, well, I don't know, and that's okay. But you do need to ask it so that you are both on the same page of not knowing, and you can discover it together. So the worst possible thing to happen is that you're thinking it's one thing, and then you go about the process of doing the data visualization only to have this really nice visualization that ends up not making any sense to the person or people that you're working with. So asking questions is very important, and it's very important to get to this level of detail about the data. Sometimes people don't know this level of detail, but if you're working with the data, then it would always behoove you to know, have an intimate knowledge of what the data is, how these variables interact with each other, and how they are related. So this is as far as I got with my worksheets that I'm developing for this process. But it helped, I think, to really identify, at the very least, it helps you to identify things that maybe should not be in the data set, or things that make you question, like this -1. Always, always, always look at the data set before you begin. A cursory look just to see what's in there, see what pops out at you. In the case of the manufacturers, I did not notice that there were 2 manufacturers that shared the same letter, the letter P. So again, that was something before we get to the visualization stage, and that you need to make sure that you're aware of. Keep in mind, up until now, we've gone through how many stages? The acquire, parse, mine. We're getting ready to filter. We have not created a visualization yet. We are getting to know this data. And so as the subtitle for yesterday, data at its core, at the core, this is the level that you spend a lot of time in this data visualization process. Once you work through this, and I will say it is tedious and it is time consuming, but once you get this intimate knowledge of what that data set is, how it's represented, it is almost smooth sailing going forward, because now you know what you're looking at. At this point, you may have some questions. I came up with some questions as I worked through this, but typically for students, I will already have some questions for them to answer initially when they're first introduced to data visualization. But sometimes you may not have questions, you may just have the data. And so you might enter this process, like I said, at any stage in this process you could be in at any given time. Okay, so I know that was a long, drawn out way to answer the question. I was debating whether or not you guys might be interested in seeing this level of detail for this. I do hope that it was helpful for you, if only for me to get some clarity on the stages as I talked about them yesterday, for you to see how you might go through and break this down. Again, once you get comfortable with the process, it is totally up to you to decide what level of detail that you would want to do in terms of exploring the data set. But for me, like I said, the more detail you have about a data set, the better it will be for you in terms of, especially when you start to create and represent the data in the visual format. Sometimes you have to revise, and when you have to revise, that might mean acquiring more data. If you have already broken this data down to this level, then that should minimize, and I say should, the amount of time that it takes you to go back to actually pull out the data, identify the data that you need to create the visualizations. So there are additional worksheets. I haven't worked through all of them yet, I've done up to the mine. And so, like I said, the next step would be to filter and represent. The filtering would be based on what questions that you're trying to answer. And then the represent stage, that would be the first time that you would be actually representing the data visually. And so that could be either manually, or if you feel that you're ready, it could be to use a tool. And so I think I created maybe 1 or 2 graphs, and I will switch over and show you this so that you can see. And again, these are just the first attempts at visualizing this data, just to kind of think about what it might look like. So I created a different tab in Excel, and I moved the graphs there. And so these were all created in Excel, just to kind of show you. And so I made a visualization of manufacturers and serial count. While I'm here, one thing I want to point out, and we'll talk about this shortly, there's something called a visualization checklist. And so these are basic things that you want to make sure that you have in whatever visualization that you create. A pet peeve of mine is please label your axes, even if you think it is intuitively obvious what that is, you still need to label it. So you have your manufacturers, and this is by code. I can always go in and, by the mappings of the coding, and change the letters to a particular, to spell out the manufacturer's name. And then that's on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, the number of serials that are represented in the data. This is another spreadsheet or graphic that's showing the serial content for each serial. So now what I'm going to do here, as you can see, there are way more serials that's actually shown here. If you stretch this down, it will, if I move these out of the way, it will show you the remaining serials that are in there. And so you can see I haven't cleaned the data. So in this case, I would say that the data hasn't been cleaned. The fact that I still have this -1 in there. And so I left that in purposefully so that you can see it. This should be an indicator here that, oh, I need to go back and take a look at that data, because there should be no minus values there. But this was just to show you the different, the type of, just a first step. This would not necessarily be my final visualization, but I just wanted to see what it might look like if I were to create some visualizations. And as I mentioned before, with the pie charts, I do not recommend them, but if you are so compelled to use the pie charts, just make sure that the number of variables that you are trying to represent in the pie charts are at a minimum, and I would say no more than 3, if that, so that you can clearly see what those variables are. So that's what I did with this data set. And I hope that just walking through this was helpful in some way. Again, like I said, I was debating whether or not to share that with you, but since the question came up, or the comment came up, I thought maybe it would be useful. So Brent, did we have any other questions? I'll try not to to take as much time to answer the next one if you don't think that it's feasible.
We've got a couple. I think a couple of them have already been addressed.
Oh, okay.
The latest one, Lynn is asking if we can get an outline for the Word document that you've been using.
Oh, the worksheets? Oh, definitely. What I will do is I will make them available on the web page. Okay. And I'm making myself a note now so that I will not forget.
And just so everybody's aware, if your question doesn't get answered today, we are recording the questions, and I will be emailing them to Vitria at the end of the day, and she can probably address them tomorrow or post answers on the website.
Yes, I will do that. And for those of you, if you had questions, so thank you, Brent, for sending those yesterday. For those of you who are on the call, you know that I had some technical issues with the thunderstorm. So that prevented me from getting those questions posted, but I do have them, and I will create the web page and add any questions that you have today to that as well. So they will be on there. Okay, I'm just making myself a note here to add the worksheets. So if you find that if you find that the worksheets are helpful for you, let me know, because I'm using them in my class and I think that they're helpful, but it would be good to see if others find them helpful. Even if you don't find them helpful, let me know that too. If you have some ways in which you think that it could be improved, I'm open to hearing your feedback on that. So I'm going to go back to the presentation. So that was our hands-on exercise that we did yesterday. Again, here's the webpage for the webinar series. If you have any comments or you don't want to go back and look at anything, that content will be there. I will be adding additional content as we go forward, and even after the webinar series ends, because there is so much information, there is no way that I could share everything that I'd like to share with you about data visualization and these different areas and aspects of data visualization. So I would say if you want to bookmark this, feel free to, because I will be adding content that I feel may be useful for you going forward. So here we are, day 2. You've got data, now what? So we've talked a lot about data. And in fact, walking through that example that we just walked through kind of hopefully gives you an idea of the level of detail that you can do. It is not required, but it will give you, like I said, a deeper understanding of what the data is and how it is represented. What you don't want is to, create a nice visualization and then somebody asks you about the data and then you not be able to respond. So this level of detail will help you. So on yesterday, we talked a little bit about the different application areas for data visualization. There is information visualization, there's BioViz, there is GeoViz, there's all kinds of viz, depending on what your area is and what the discipline is that you're working in. And so what we want to do today is just continuing on just a little bit about the different types of data. And so I touched on it a little bit in those worksheets that I just walked through, categorizing your data, knowing if it's a nominal variable, if it's ordinal. And so these slides are available to you. I've hyperlinked these, and so you should be, these links that you see here, so you should be able to go and look at those, just to kind of give you a feel for the different types of data that you have. One of the things that you should be thinking about as you are going through this process, these are some questions. What real life behavior does the data reflect? So each of you have your own different types of data that you're working with. And so these questions may vary slightly, but just be thinking about, what do I need to know, or what behavior is evident in the data that I have? What are the strengths of the data and of the data sources? So remember, I talked briefly about primary data sources versus secondary data sources. If you're creating your own data, that's primary data. You control that. If you are working with secondary data sources, you need to be comfortable and confident that you have good data sources, because as I'm sure you've heard, garbage in, garbage out. That also applies to the data visualizations. The quality of your data will impact the output of the visualizations that you create. Is the data summarized? So sometimes we'll get data that has already been summarized. If you have the option or the choice, always work with or ask for the raw data. You can do so much more with the raw data. Now, you may not always have access to raw data, but if you have the opportunity to work with raw data, do so. Make a backup of it before you actually do anything with it, so that you can come back to it. But it's always good to have raw data to work with. What are the weaknesses of the data sources? So are there missing data? That was one of the things we just talked about or looked at, or one of the things that you noticed in that data set that you've been working with, the serial data set. Some of the data looked a little suspicious. Why would there be minus negative ones values in this data set? It should not be. Also, think about, and I've said this several times in my comments to myself, does this make sense? That's a simple question. And if the answer is no, then that is an indicator that maybe you need to take a closer look at that data. Is it in the format that you need it to be in? Sometimes you'll have to manipulate the data in the sense of massaging it so that it gets into the data, into the format that you need it to be in, that your tool will use. Some of you may be programmers, and so that you have to, when you're writing a program, to read in data, it has to be in a certain format. Was the data given to you in that format? If not, then that may require you to do a little programming. And so it's always good to have or to point out what these weaknesses are, just so that once you start working with the data, whether that's programming with the data or creating visualizations with the data, knowing what the strengths and the weaknesses are will be helpful. What information is emphasized in the data? What is the central focus of the data? Because if you are working towards answering a specific question and you don't have the data that you need to address that specific question, then you will need to go and acquire that information, or you may have to change the questions that you're trying to answer. It just depends on what you have access to and with the data. At what level of granularity is the data provided? Again, is it summarized? Do you have access to the raw data? Is it already categorized, or can you create your own categories? You know, sometimes, and many of you, when you're working with your own research data, that's one of the privileges that you have when you have your own data. You can categorize it the way you want, or the way that it needs to be to address whatever research question that you're working on. And so you would need to know, if you're working with secondary data, what is the granularity of that data? So that gives you some idea of how much flexibility that you have. And then lastly, what is the scope of the data? You know, what topics can be covered using this data? Is there a time range or frame? You won't always have a time component. Sometimes you will, but if you do, there are a lot of different things that you could do. You can visualize with that as well. Is the data for a specific area or discipline or demographic? That also impacts how you would go about visualizing the data. So these are 6 questions that I've outlined here. Again, these are not the only questions that you can or should ask, but this is to get you to start thinking about what questions that you should ask. So don't just take the data set and say, okay, I'm just going to do some visualizations. Give it some thought. As I mentioned on yesterday, you can learn how to use a data visualization tool at any time. You really don't need me to help you to do that. The value that I bring, or the things I'm trying to share with you over the course of this week, is to start thinking more deeply and critically about your own data. Ask questions. That's the only way that you're going to, and not only ask questions of, the data set, but ask the questions of yourself. Am I looking at this the right way? Is there a different perspective that I haven't considered? And so questions are the things that help you to uncover those hidden gems that exist in the data set itself. So why do we need to know all of that? I said all of that to say this. I love this particular visualization. Now, some people like it, some people don't. I like it especially for students who are new to data visualization, because now you have all this data. I've just, weighed you down with all of the information about getting to know very specifics about your data. Now, what do I do with it? And so what this chart gives you, again, is a starting point. And what I like about it is in the middle, it says, what would you like to show? And so sometimes it can be a bit overwhelming to have at your disposal this raw data and all of the amounts of data that you deal with. And so just knowing, if you want to make a comparison, what type of chart should I look at? If you want to show the relationships that exist between different variables, then this is the type of chart that you might want to look at. Maybe you have 2 variables, you have 3 variables. If you want to do composition, or if you want to do distribution. And so again, as with all of the things that I'm sharing with you this week, this is just another that is meant to be a starting point to help you to start thinking about how you want to represent this data. And so I provided the web link to this. There's some more literature too that we're going to look at, and some other web links that I've provided on the web page, on the website, that will be useful as well. But I think this is a great starting point. And so I've had several people that have asked me, where do I start? What's the first thing that I do after now I have the data? Like we said, so what now? What do I do? This is intended to give you some ideas as to what you might look at. And there's our little trusty pie chart here on the bottom row. It is there to be thorough, but again, keep those caveats in mind. You want to kind of steer away from pie charts if you can. And now we've come to the point where we're going to take a look at, well, first of all, are there any questions that anyone might have that I can answer before we go on to the next segment here? I'm going to take silence to mean no. If you do have questions, feel free to interrupt. So now we have data, we understand it, we know that there's a next step to this. So what do we do? And so there is on the website, if you go to day 2, this is just a snapshot here, what you're seeing that I included in the this presentation. There is a list of things here that I felt like would be very helpful for all of you to be aware of. And so I'm going to stop sharing again this page so that I could go to the website. And I'm not sure if I have it open. Okay, give me one moment. I have too many things open. And not the right thing. Okay. Let me see. Stop presenting. Okay. Oh, there we are. So hopefully you guys can see I am on the webinar webpage on page 2. And because I updated this, if you had bookmarked it, you may need to refresh your browser to be able to see this. So here is a core principles for data visualization. So can you guys see it should say Data Viz cheat sheet?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So again, tip of the iceberg here. There's a lot of information that goes into design principles, and that was one of the questions that was asked on yesterday. And so these are some of it is repeated on the other links as well, but I thought that I would give you various things that you could look at, and you can choose the level of detail that you prefer. So best of all, the first thing is to reduce clutter. Oftentimes, so one of the major mistakes that sometimes people do, and I've had this experience where I have been creating visualizations for someone and they give me this huge data set and they want to see everything, every variable in the visualization. You are defeating your own purpose if you try to put everything into one visualization. Again, remember, the purpose of visualization is insight. And so what I had to do was to appeal to them to say, it's okay to have multiple visualizations. You shouldn't have to put everything in there because then it's hard to read. Also, think about using, instead of color sometimes, using patterns, because then you get to reach an even broader audience, which is those members of the audience who are colorblind, who may not say, hey, I'm colorblind. Typically, they've learned how to adjust to it. And so if they are, they may not say that they are colorblind, but if you include different patterns for feeling different aspects of the visualization, for example, in this case here, they're showing you're going from a 3D, hopefully you can see my mouse moving around, from in the section where it says reduce the clutter. The first visualization is in 3D representation, and they're recommending that you go to 2D. It's much easier to see the values, to see the data that's there, but also they went to a solid color, but I'm going to encourage you, particularly for papers that you write and you have visualizations in there, whether they're pie charts or bar charts, consider using patterns for fields as opposed to a solid color, unless it's just black and white. think about, again, like I said, you want to make sure, one of my pet peeves is not labeling axes and not providing titles for your visualizations. My students will tell you I take off for that, because what you don't want to do is to assume or make your reader assume or try to figure out what you're talking about. Remember, the whole purpose of having the visual is to make it easier for the person that's reading it. And so these are just some of the things that's on this page here. Core principles of data visualizations. Show the data. I'm going to say use your best judgment for yourself. You know, think about, does this make sense to me? Is it clear to me? That's one thing. And then get some feedback. That is invaluable. Oftentimes we work so closely with our data, with our work, that we can't see the slight things that are going on there because we're so close to it. So another stage of the data visualization process is to get feedback or to get critiques. Typically, I do the critiques after you create the visualization, but you can get critiqued or feedback at any stage of the data visualization process. And so I encourage you to make that a standard piece of a standard part of that data visualization process, because the more feedback that you get, the better your output will be. And so this page just shows you some different ways, different aspects of principles of data visualization. Sometimes you can, the whole purpose of visualization is to show things that are different, to highlight patterns. There are different ways in which you can do that. You can play around with size. You can play around with color. You can vary the shape of things. Sometimes also by proximity, you might be able to show relevance to different things. And this, what's on the screen now, is showing you different ways in which you can do pre-attentive processing. So our visual system that is built into us as human beings, we try to make sense of things visually in our minds. And so sometimes if things are close by each other, or you have something that isn't all the way closed, for example, down here where it says closure, even though there's only one circle that is completely closed in that little section that says closure, in our minds, we can basically figure out, okay, this is a circle, or it would be a circle. It's just some part, maybe something is overlaid on top of it or something like that. So you can use different things like density, curvature. In one of the examples that I showed yesterday, when I was asking how many sevens do you see in that sea of numbers that was zeros and ones plus sevens. And so putting things close together that look similar sometimes makes it difficult to pick those out, but other times it makes it easy to see how they're grouped together and clustered. And so you can play around with the color of things. You know, color means different things, different meanings. Again, be cognizant of your population that may be colorblind, but you can play with the hue of things, the saturation of things. So different things that will help aspects of your data to stand out is what you can do. Again, this is just an example here. I'm not going to go through all of it. I'm just going to kind of scroll down because you have the links there. And so as you are working on your different visualizations, thinking about the different types of data that you have, do you have enough to do geospatial type data to create a map, or to do different things? Just think about, these are some core principles that you can incorporate. So I'm going to go back here. I don't want to run out of time before we can get to Tableau. But there is one more thing I would like to share. If you go back to the course webpage, not course, the webinar webpage, I'm thinking ahead to the fall already. There is another link. I can get there. There we are. Okay. There are several links there, But one that I really want to highlight is okay. There's the visualization checklist. So as you are creating your visualizations, you can use this as kind of a guide, again, to make sure that you are, at the very least, making sure that you are following the guidelines that are, I guess you could say, are acceptable in terms of just the basic principles that are being adhered to. And so the reason why I like this is because it gives you different sections of this. So it talks about how text is represented, and it gives you some rating there if you wanted to rate yourself, but it also gives you some examples on what different types of visualization layouts might look like. It gives you examples about using labels. One thing that's really nice too is to, and this is not one of them, is to find some visualizations that you don't like. And then ask yourself, why don't I like this? What's wrong with this? And so that also will help to inform yourself on when you're creating your own visualizations of things not to do. So in this day and age, there's so much data out there, so many visualizations that are being created, that it is impossible to not see a bad visualization at some point. And so as you are in your daily practice, when you come across something and you say, well, that doesn't make sense, you just take a deeper look and see what they've done, and then kind of think about, well, how would you improve that, and how that might help to inform you as well as to when you're creating your own visualizations and you may not be thinking about these principles. So this is a nice example, a nice page. In particular, I'm going to scroll back up here. I think if you click on this, yes, it will take you, it'll give you the PDF version of this. So you could literally download it. So that's the text part of it. It talks about different colors that are used, the arrangement of things, proportion and size. That's another thing that you want to be aware of when you're creating the visualizations. You want to make sure that the data, that you're staying true to the nature of the data. Visualizations can be created to highlight whatever point of view that you are trying to convey. The best thing is to do is to represent that data in its unique, in its inherent way, and then let the viewer come to their own conclusions without any kind of nudging from you. And when I say nudging from you, which I mean, don't skew the data in a certain way just to get your point across. It is always better to, respect the intelligence of your viewers and allow them to come to their own conclusions. And so these things that are listed here, they talk about lines, and they give you some overall things to take a look at, particularly, what things draw our attention. And so being aware of those as well, sometimes that helps. At the bottom, they give you what they call the anatomy chart, data visualization anatomy chart. So these are just some good examples to think about or to be aware of as you are creating different visualizations. I'm going to go back here. And let's see. So now I am back on day 2. And there is a link that says a tour through the visualization zoo. There's also a paper about this, a detailed paper about this topic, which I thought was very nicely entitled. And so the paper is a bit dated, but again, it's a good starting point for you to look at how to represent different types of data. And one of the reasons why I like this site is because it is interactive. So if you click on, so I would encourage you to go and read the paper because it gives you a lot more detail about each one of these different types of visualizations that you can create. But any of the visualizations that you see on this link, they are hyperlinked. And so I think it's really nice to be able to actually see an interactive visualization. And remember, those 7 stages that we talked about yesterday and somewhat today, the last stage of the visualization process is the interact stage. And that's not always implemented because sometimes you don't have to, but it's really neat to be able to see this. And so if you, at your leisure, take a look and see, hover over something and it will interact, or you can see an interactive type visualization. So we talked a little bit about time series data. There's a whole body of literature and work that can be done in terms of time series data. Here's an example of stacked graphs. If you click on it, it will take you to this graph as well. And so this one doesn't have the interactive feature that I just demonstrated before on the previous one, but it will allow you to change the view. And so that's another type of interactive feature. So why am I showing you this? Again, whatever I'm showing you or sharing with you in terms of data visualization, my hope is that you're thinking about, do I have this type of data? Or maybe I have this type of data. I hadn't thought about looking at it in this way. And so these are meant to be resources for you. Here are some multiple scan line graphs that are interactive as well. As you can see, as you move over each one of the graphs, it shows you the data point below. So you may have some data that looks like this. They also provide you with the data sources. And so if you want to go and take a closer look at any of the data that was used to create these visualizations, you can do that as well. So I won't go and click on all of them, but they are all interactive. And so I wanted to point that out to you. I do like the parallel coordinates, so I will click on that just to kind of point out some things here. And so if you have a lot of data and you want to be able to show correlations or linkages, how they're mapped together, then consider parallel coordinates, because that allows you to look at an enormous amount of data in one visualization. And you can use color again to show different things, different aspects of the data as well. Here's our famous chart that we looked at earlier. Since we've already looked at it, I won't click on it here. If you have geographic type data, you can do visualizations using maps, but you then use different ways to represent that data. So there's a lot of different things that you can do. You have to do what makes sense to you, or what you feel will help you to display your data in the most informative way that will help people to understand the data that you have and how you're representing it. And so this is an example of that. So very good source. Like I said, the paper itself is a bit dated, but it is a good starting point, especially if you are new to data visualization. I'm going to skip down a little bit just because I want to make sure that I show this to you guys. This is a book. It is freely downloadable. If you click on it, it's freebooks.com or something like that, but it's about data and design. And so if you want to know more about any of the things or the topics that I've covered today on designing data visualizations, this is a good book to take a look at, and it's free and it's online, which I know is always good for students. If you click on this link, this is like the mother of all, to me, of all resources for data visualization. What's really cool about this, not only is it interactive, but it gives you, as it states at the top, data visualization tools and books. So if there's a book that you're interested in, or maybe you're looking for a type of book that will help you in creating different types of visualizations, this is a good source to take a look. And so as you can see, as I mentioned before, your first tool will not be your last tool. There are lots of data visualization tools in here. When you click on it on one, it will tell you as you hover, the graphs on this dashboard will update. It will take you directly to the link that you click on, so it's hyperlinked. So depending on what your interests are in terms of data visualization, this I think is a really good tool. So there are tools there are books as well. So I wanted to make sure that I covered this, at least pointed it out to you so that you can be aware of what's out there. So these are all different types of data viz books. This is the Ben Fry book that I've mentioned that we talked about with the data visualization process. So it is available here, or there's a link to it. And so if you're interested in it, I would definitely encourage you to take a look at that as well. Okay, so now I'm going to go back and stop sharing. And let's see where we are. Okay, so now what I'd like to do is, hopefully you've downloaded Tableau. If you don't have the data set, you didn't get it from or you weren't on the session yesterday, it is available on day 1. It is the serial data. So we're going to play around with that because now we're really familiar with it. And so if you will start up Tableau, and I'm going to do the same thing here. And I will share my screen momentarily once Tableau opens. And so if you've started with the trial, it's a 14-day trial. If you are students, you can extend the trial. You can get a user license. You have to contact Tableau directly. Make sure that you use your university email address and just let them know that you are a student and you would like to obtain a student license for Tableau, and they should send you a license. So as long as you're a student, then you would have access to it. If you're not a student, unfortunately, I think you will have to pay for it. So especially if you're doing research with the data and you want to be able to use Tableau for that. So you would have to use, you would have to pay for it. So now I'm assuming that everyone has Tableau installed. And so what we're going to do, if you haven't already, is to locate the data file. And so I provided the Microsoft Excel version and the text file version. And so what I'm going to do, because I have all of those formulas and graphs and things in my Excel file, I'm going to attempt to remember where I saved my file. Let's see here. Maybe it's here. Nope. Nope. Okay, so don't do like me and forget where you saved it. That is never good. Documents. Oh. Okay, so I'm going to assume you know where you saved your document. I'm going to have to locate mine. And if you're able to load it into Tableau, you should be able to load the spreadsheet, and there's a little icon in the upper right corner that says show me. And so what we're going to try to do is load that file, and where did I put it? Ah, there we are. Okay, so you should see something that looks like this. I have to laugh at myself. Okay, so we have our data that has been read in, and it's recognizing it. And so what we want to do then is to create a spreadsheet or a worksheet. And as you can see, all of the variables are listed here. And this gets back to, if you think about it, on one of those worksheets that I was working with where it said to categorize the data. And you can see that the categories that they recognize are similar to the ones that I had listed on my worksheet. And so just this would be considered for me a sanity check. if I were to see something that was out of order here, or something in some place that I didn't think it should be, then that would be like a red flag. Okay, so now what do we want to do? What do we want to visualize? And so over here, you see in the upper right corner something that says show me. Once you have loaded your variables into or your data into Tableau, this will give you some ideas of how you can visualize the data. And so it's really nice in the sense that if you're unsure about how you want to represent your data, if you hover over one of these different layouts, it will tell you at the bottom there, what do you need in order to create that particular type of visualization. So I'm going to say I want to look at maybe cereal. And so I'm going to put the columns, and I may move these around once I look and see what's there, or how it looks. And then for the cereal, I want to look at sugar content and maybe sodium. And so what you do is you can just move your variables into the worksheet area. If I scan over or hover over any others, the indicators at the bottom tells me what I need in order to, or how many of them, how many dimensions do I need, or how many measures do I need in order to create that type of visualization. If you want to add color, I'm just going to take that variable and drop it on there onto the mark that says color. And as you can see, it automatically provided color. What I'm going to do now, unfortunately, I see we're running out of time. I've talked a lot today, it seems. I want to show you one more thing on the web page to call to your attention. Let's see. Because we will be moving on to ParaView tomorrow, I want to make sure that I point out the training modules for Tableau. Okay, hold on. So on page 2, in the section that says Getting Started with Tableau, there's a link that says Tableau Training. And what I've done is I've located several training modules and created this web page. And so there are, I believe, 7 different modules. And within each module, there are different exercises, well, there are 9 that you can work on. You can work through these in any order that you feel comfortable, although I do recommend that you at least work through parts 1 and parts 2, all of part 1, and then after that, depending upon what your interests are, what you're trying to do with Tableau, then you can take a look at the video. There's also a transcript there, and the data files are there as well. So if you've downloaded Tableau, these data files will look similar, but I'm going to encourage you, the data files comes with Tableau, the downloaded version that you have, but I'm going to encourage you as you work, if you're going to try to work through any of these, that you download the data file that is connected or mapped to the training here, because the video is specifically for that part of the data. So if you're interested in working with R, I think they've added R using Tableau, or using R within Tableau. If you're not interested in that, maybe you're looking at building a dashboard, you can just go directly to that particular video. The reason why I provided this, and we haven't spent a lot of time, I know, today with Tableau, but they do a really good job of explaining how to get your data into Tableau and for creating different types of visualizations. There is an element called Tableau on Demand. So if there is something that that is not here that you would like to figure out how to do, you can always email me, but you can also always visit their website. They do a phenomenal job with making this content easy to follow and easy to use. So with that, did anyone have any questions? I do apologize for talking so much. When I went over the worksheets, that kind of took up more time than I had anticipated, but I do hope that it was helpful for you.
So Dr. Bird, Subhash asks, do the variable names under tables load by default in Tableau?
The variable names under table. Oh, you mean the variables that you have in your data set? So it should read, if I'm understanding the question, if you have the variables listed in columns like we had it in this serial data set, it will try to figure out for you how the heading should be. And then if it's not read in the way that you would expect it to be, you could always go in and edit the table. But it should read it in exactly in the order and in the way that it is in your data file. So again, this is was intended to be an introduction to information visualization, that aspect of data viz. And I've provided a lot of resources to you. I do encourage you to take a look at the content that I didn't click on page 2 and also page 1 as well. I will continue to update the web page, the website, with information and answer the questions. And so in answering your questions that will be sent to me, if I see that something could be further expanded on or clarified, I will go ahead and include that information in the answers that I provide.
All right, that was excellent, Vitria. Thank you. Thank you to the audience. Unless anybody has any questions, we can stop the recording and we can then reconvene tomorrow.
Yes. Thank you all for your time today.
Thanks all.
Okay.
So Brent, could we stop the recording?